Attention, all ISKCON devotees. We are beginning a program to honor the appearance or disappearance?
Disappearance.
The disappearance day of Jayananda Prabhu, Jayananda Thakur. Everyone is welcome to attend. All those who attend get a free ticket for as much halwa as they can eat. Thinking that if Jayananda knew we were doing this, he would stop the program. He would not allow it. So the only way we can glorify him uninterruptedly is for him not to know we're doing this. And sometimes, although it's very good for us, somehow he wouldn't like this. But anyway, after Jayananda Prabhu died, then Prabhupada said, if possible, we should put his picture on the Rath Yatra cart, which I think is normally done now, and we should honor his disappearance day just as we honor the days of the other Vaishnavas. So, I think in that sense, he would allow us to do this because Prabhupada asked us to do it. So Prabhupada asked us to celebrate the disappearance of Jayananda Prabhu, and I think there's a lot we can gain from meditating on him and his pastimes and activities that not just is entertaining or funny, because that will be there also, because his pastimes are very entertaining, they're very pleasing to hear, oftentimes funny, but when we meditate on who he was as a person and realize that he had something that very few devotees have, we can use this day to become not only inspired, but I think to make some significant change in our own consciousness, our own heart. And I will try as best I can to relate my impressions of him in regards to who he was as a person that could help us become better devotees and also better people. And I wanted to thank Labanga for doing this. Let's give her a big hand. This is, I find this event is important, and I'm hoping that in the future it will become more and more popular and well attended. And I think it's important for devotees not only to become purified by hearing about Jayananda, but because Jayananda didn't have an official position in ISKCON, although he was temple president for a while, but basically he didn't really hold official positions, and he never wanted to take sannyas. He never wanted to be GBC. That was his nature. So naturally, there's a tendency to notice the people who are in front, the people who have position. We notice them, and then there's a tendency that they get the honor. So he kept himself in the back, but he was special. I think amongst all Prabhupada's disciples, he was special, and therefore it's only proper that he be honored and glorified, even though he didn't hold any specific position in ISKCON. I mean, of course, at that time, he left during Prabhupada's presence, so there was no opportunity for him to become a spiritual master. And so naturally, spiritual master will have disciples, so when the spiritual master leaves, the disciples will naturally honor him, but he didn't have any disciples, so that's why I think this is so important for the health of ISKCON that we honor someone like Jayananda. And so, all of you who have come, I thank you for coming, showing your valuing this event by being here to honor Jayananda. I hope you didn't come just to get halwa. Well, even if you did, you're still fortunate to be here. So we're going to ask Bhaskar to speak some words about Jayananda.
Don't make me cry.
I was very fortunate to have a very small amount of association with Jayananda. It was in 1976 in New York City. And previously I'd been a devotee in Australia, and I had a desire to meet some of the devotees that we had heard about from Australia, which was very far away. So I'd wanted to meet Vishnu Jananda Swami because his kirtans were so amazing. And that wish was fulfilled at that time. And of course I wanted to meet Jayananda because we'd heard about how he inaugurated and instigated the Rath Yatra movement in the Western world. And that wish was later to be fulfilled. In Australia we'd already had 2 Rath Yatras, so I'd had some experience with how to work on Rath Yatra carts. So I did my little bit of service, and I could see around the temple, I would see Jayananda all the time. And he would be with his group of young men. You know, they were his working men, and they were all big men. And Jayananda was a very, very big man himself. He was over 6 feet tall, and he was very broad. He had a very big smiling face, and all his crew were big guys also. So they were very stout, very strong men. I was doing my bit of service there at that temple at that time. And we'd get a little association with Jayananda occasionally, perhaps sit in the temple and chant chapel with him, things like that. But I wanted some close association. I actually wanted to serve. Yeah, I wanted to do some service with Jayananda. So anyway, I finished my service, and I asked the temple president I would like to go and join the crew, work on the Rath Yatra. And he said, okay, off you go. And I made my way to the carts, and I met Jayananda. And he said, yeah, okay, Bhaskar, what do you think you can do? How can you help me? What service do you want to do? I'll do whatever you've got. And he said, okay, I want you to make the spires that sit on the top of the top, you know, the golden bit up top there. Okay. You know how to make them? Probably not, but I'll figure it out, Jayananda. Don't worry about that. So I gave him a list of what I wanted, and the next day he shows up. He had this funny old car that he would drive, and really, like a wreck. You wouldn't think it should even be. I've not even seen in India a car worse than this car that Jayananda would drive. And the boot was always going like that, you know, at the back, and it would go up and down as he drove along the road. Bang, bang, bang. And I don't even think the doors closed properly then. So they would use pieces of wire to tie the car together. So next day he comes in this big old car, and he's got everything I wanted inside the back of the car. And we pull it out. And it's about 3 weeks before the Rath Yatra. So, I set to work and I make bits and pieces. And this doesn't sound like it's got a lot to do with Jayananda, but this whole time I'm in his association. So he'd be working here or he'd be working there. And I'm doing my little thing here. But all the time I can see Jayananda, he's just going from spot to spot on these 3 very big carts. And he had quite a few men working for him at this time. And a lot of them were devotees, and some were not devotees. Some men would just kind of stumble into the sight, and Jayananda would somehow or other offer them some prasadam, and pretty soon he would have them helping out. Maybe they were doing a bit of painting, or they would be just cleaning up, or helping somebody else carry something. He had a way of engaging people. So I started, I get my things finished, and gradually the Rath Yatra carts are getting finished. And we know that Srila Prabhupada is due to arrive fairly soon, it's going to be a few more days. And Srila Prabhupada eventually did arrive in New York, a few days before the festival. This was in 1976, so this was 10 years after Srila Prabhupada had set foot in the United States. And unbeknownst to me at the time, this was to be a celebration of that fact that Srila Prabhupada had gone to the West. 10 years later, the celebration was going to be held. We all thought this was to be a Rath Yatra. In actual fact, it was Lord Krishna arranging the celebration on behalf of Srila Prabhupada. He was celebrating Srila Prabhupada's accomplishments and achievements and his stout and resolute devotion. But this never actually occurred to me at the time. I thought it was just another Rath Yatra. I'd seen a few, they were very nice. But the transcendental mellows that had been developing, these were under the surface. They weren't obvious to us. And it's only in later years that these things come to light that you start to notice what actually happened and what actually occurred. So Jayananda was, in fact, a great servant of Srila Prabhupada, and he was fulfilling Srila Prabhupada's desire. Srila Prabhupada had this desire to have a huge Rath Yatra in New York that at some time or other. At the same time, Jayananda is fulfilling Lord Krishna's desires, Lord Jagannath's desire to glorify Srila Prabhupada in this manner. And this was a kind of spiritual competitiveness which had developed. On one hand, Lord Krishna is attempting in the guise, in this manner, to glorify his pure devotee and his vast accomplishments. On the other hand, is Srila Prabhupada, he's not having any of that. He's there to glorify the Lord. So it's developing in that manner. So we get very close to having the carts ready. It was a very cold year that year in New York. It was very, very cold. And the workers would all sleep at the rail yards where the carts were being built. I was a little bit used to sleeping in the open with the devotees, having been involved with some Rath Yatras and having done some Sankirtan, in Australia where you would take a van and you would drive for thousands of miles and you're just selling the books from your van, far from any temples. But it was very cold there. And I don't even think it was like the height of winter or anything. It must have been autumn. It was bitterly cold. And it was being done in a rail yards, which was quite close to the river. This is the western, New York's an island, so there's the river flows down both sides. This place was having a breeze flowing through it all of the time. But Jayananda kept everybody's spirits up. By and large, he did that by feeding vast amounts of prasadam to his workers. He could always be counted on to get a truck full of prasadam, what appeared to be a truck full, but a vehicle would show up at the end of the day and there would be so much prasadam in there. And that was what kept people going. I think that's what kept Jayananda going for many years. It wasn't even just so much the eating of the prasadam, he liked to give in prasadam. He would give so much prasadam. Everybody was forced to eat far more than they actually needed. Of course, we need a lot of prasadam. This is sanctified food. This is the Lord's mercy, so we need as much of that as we can possibly get. And it was a very tasty delight when the vehicle would show up. And in the breakfast prasadam also, Jayananda we would be in the temple for breakfast. He'd have one or two men left guarding the carts, but people would go back to the temple, have the morning program. And breakfast prasadam was personally served by Jayananda. He would put it on your plate, and he would load his plates up like you'd never seen. I've seen Bengali people eat rice. We've all seen Bengalis eat rice. They can put away a lot of rice. But the amounts of prasadam that Jayananda expected the devotee to eat was on par with that, probably exceeding that. Really big. And anything that fell off your plate too, you had to eat everything. Whatever fell off the plate, you were going to eat it, no matter what. And he wouldn't let you get away with not eating it. And he would sit in the temple room chanting japa in the morning, and his crew would sit nearby. They would sit around him or next to him or nearby. And that was a transcendental experience also. The Jayananda would sit there. He would intently chant. He wouldn't just sit there chanting. He would sit there, his eyes would be closed, and he would just nod like this. Like he really chanted japa hard. And not particularly loudly, but loudly enough for him and those around him to hear. So you got a real aura of his intensity as you just by sitting near the man when he chanted japa. And it's worth remembering too that at this time this time when I knew him anyway, he was suffering from leukemia. I believe it's called leukemia anyway. So he was really quite ill, and he hadn't let this on to anybody other than just a few devotees, one or two of his closer friends. They knew about this. But it was a few days, perhaps a week or two before the festival, and I saw Jayananda walking down a hallway with Murli Krishna. Murli, he was a big man himself, but he was dwarfed beside Jayananda. But Jayananda walking along, and he looked so ill. I couldn't believe that the guy was still able to walk and move and operate on such a level of performance. This leukemia, I think, was a fairly developed stage at this time. And leukemia, I guess, it was eventually finished his life, or the life of that body. But I said to him, Jayananda, you're looking like you're ready to trade this body in for a new body. What's going on? And he just stopped and he looked at me and he said, yeah, I know, it's true. I'm not feeling so good. but then he just kind of stood up again. Yeah, just stood straight, you know, kind of picked up the shoulders and just kind of thundered forward with his big mate, this Murli Krishna. And they just, went on with their business. So he wasn't going to let the infirmities and the frailties that come along with this type of these bodies. He wasn't going to let any of that slow him down. He had one focus. He was extremely focused. It's the pleasure of Srila Prabhupada. He was on Prabhupada's side no matter what. And of course there was no matter what. He was just single-minded about it. So as the carts were approaching completion, I finished my little service. Vaidyabhyasa Maharaj, at the time he was just a young brahmachari. He had finished making the parrots. I remember the parrots, they were very pretty. They sat on the top. He's now a big GBC man, he's in Fiji, he's got a beautiful temple there. It's a big following of Indian devotee Vaishnavas. By the time he's just a little young brahmachari. I can still remember him sitting there carving out these green parrots to go on the top of that cart. So we did we had it all finished, everything's ready to go, we're ready to put the cart together. It's just, I think, all the components. This 2 or 3 days before the festival was due to begin. Srila Prabhupada had already been down to visit the site early one morning. He had been there with all the sannyasis, and they had looked closely and they were circumambulated the big carts. There were 3 big carts. 2 were brand new. Queen Subhadra's cart had been used previously in Boston. It was a very, very pretty cart. The big ones were larger than anything ISKCON had built before anywhere in the world. They said Lord Balaram's cart stood 60 feet high, which is very high. That's, 15 meters, 16 meters even. Big, big thing. So they were ready to put all the components, the last of the components. The last of the components is the covering on the canopy. So they run the framework for the canopy up without the canopy on it, just to make sure it goes properly. So they drive it up, winding, it's going up and up and up and up and up. Very tall. In this big old rail yards, and it's surrounded by these very, very tall New York style buildings. And this, even with these big tall buildings around it, this canopy from the ground anyway, it looked, not the canopy, the frame, it looked enormously tall. This was Balaram's cart. It was actually bigger than Lord Jagannath's cart. And then they wound up Lord Jagannath's, so it's a bit shorter. Didn't look quite as impressive. Queen Subhadra, she knew it worked well because it had been used previously. Jayananda, and for one reason or other, he comes over and singles me out. He comes over and says, well, Bhaskara, what do you think? Is it beautiful or is it beautiful? And I say, yeah, it's really beautiful. It's going to look far, far better when the canopy's on, Jayananda, when we talk about the canopy. And then I said, Jayananda, this thing's going to fall over. It's not going to stand up. It's too dangerous. It's so big, you've got 90% chance it'll fall over. And this will be in the parade, 2 days later. And Jayananda, and to his great credit, he didn't just laugh at me. He looked at me and he just started to digest what I was saying to him. And I was just a young man. I hadn't completed high school, I hadn't been to engineering school, I hadn't learned anything of any note in my life. but I had the most distinct impression that we had a disaster in the making on our hands. And if what I was feeling was going to happen, it was going to happen on Fifth Avenue in New York City, it would have been a disaster on the behalf of the ISKCON and on behalf of Srila Prabhupada, and he would not have been happy. So I felt compelled to tell him, and I did. So, to Jayananda's credit, he listened. And then we wound the top down. And Jayananda went on and he sat down, and we worked amongst ourselves in trying to figure out a way to reinforce what we're going to put up, force what might go wrong. And it was a lot of work to do that. It meant we had to, make a few changes here and a few changes there. It was a telescoping kind of arrangement. Whereas pieces of steel would fit inside of other pieces of steel. Jayananda had invented all this. He was very inventive. He was actually an engineer himself. I don't know where he learned engineering, but I do know where he learned his bhakti. He learned bhakti in ISKCON under the direction of Srila Prabhupada. And he was totally focused on fulfilling the desire of Srila Prabhupada in this sense. And Prabhupada wanted this festival to go on, this parade to go on. And no matter what happened, Jayananda was bound to make it happen. So we repaired it. The next day, everything's ready to try it again. This time we put the canopy on. The big, beautiful coloured canopies. You've all seen them. We put it on. There were 5 or 6 of us on top of the cart. And we wound this is Balaram's cart again. For some reason, all I can remember is Lord Balaram's cart. I can't remember the other carts at all. Probably because nothing went wrong with them. So we wound it up. And it's up for a few seconds only. There's a bit of a gust of wind. And in theory, we were supposed to be able to hold this thing straight by having 4 ropes. Well, the 4 ropes were insufficient to the job. And the moment it got to the top, and it wasn't even a huge gust of wind, but the leverage that it was able to gain at such a height, 60-odd feet high, was quite extreme. And the canopy just started to keel over, and seemingly it just went in slow motion, just centimetre by centimetre. And suddenly the whole lot fell down. Some of it on top of us, some of it onto the ground beside the carts. But it felt earth-shattering at the time. It was quite an experience. Luckily, nobody was hurt. Nobody was injured. The canopy fell off. The canopy collapsed. The cart was steady. The cart's so heavy it wasn't going to turn over. But the canopy, including its framework, just keeled over. The next day was the parade. So we picked ourselves up in the wreckage and tidied things up a little, and then we came together and we all sat down together. And there was no chairs there. There was just old paint tins or boxes or something. So we sat down and we tried to figure what are we going to do. And there seemed to be no obvious solution because we're just surrounded by what appeared to be an enormous disaster. Jayananda eventually said, well, I guess we're only having 2 carts. Is that right? And he's looking around at everybody and nobody's thinking we're just going to have 2 carts. Everybody's thinking we're going to have 3 carts because that's the standard. That's what Srila Prabhupada expects. And Maheshwari says to Jayananda, no, we're going to have 3 carts. And we're going to fix it tonight, Jayananda. And now these men had been working for Jayananda for 3 months, building these 2 big carts. And they were totally devoted to him. And there was no way that they were going to let him down at this late stage of the game. Same as Jayananda was 100% devoted to Srila Prabhupada. And these men were 100% devoted to Jayananda at this point in their lives. I know that Murli Krishna, he was so close to Jayananda. He was a brand new bhakta. This was the first devotional activity he'd performed. And these guys had almost literally single-handedly, he and his bigger brother, had worked with Jayananda, through some terrible weather. And they'd stolen half the materials for this cart. There'd been very little money, not enough help, not enough tools. In a most exposed and difficult situation, they built these carts. So we all banded together and we pulled the wreckage apart. And Jayananda he went and sat down on the only seat that was in this rail yard, which was an old burgundy sofa that somebody had placed there a few days previously. Nobody knows why, and nobody had dared to sit in it because Jayananda would not sit on the seat, because the seat in that situation appeared to be some kind of throne, and we all felt like this about the thing. And Jayananda, he got up, and he always took his notes in one of those little spiral notebooks, so he got up and he walked over to this big old burgundy sofa and he sat down on it. The first time anyone had sat on it. And we were all aghast, we were just dumbstruck. We were sitting there just staring at Jayananda. Our mouths were literally hanging open. This Jayananda he'd been squeezed so hard by Krishna in this event. This event had just forced him to take what Krishna was offering. And what Krishna was said to be offering, glorification. This was New York City, the rail yards near the East River, 1976. You were there, eh? Yeah. It was just like it was a big throne. It was almost like a Vyasa-san. Obviously it wasn't a Vyasa-san, but Krishna had put it there for Jayananda to sit in at that time. Nobody had sat in it before, and no one had sat in it afterwards. And Jayananda sat there and he worked out what we could remedy and salvage out of the thing. So we worked all night under his direction. And this, mind you, was the second time we tried to solve this issue of the canopy. But this time we solved it properly. So if you look closely at pictures of that Rath Yatra, you'll notice that the canopy is strangely folded. You can see that it's truncated. It only ended up being a few meters shorter than the original had been. It still looked transcendently stunning and beautiful and awe-inspiring, and it's just the way Lord Balaram wanted it, I believe. He didn't want to be in a larger cut than Lord Gaga. So we managed to put that back together. The next morning the carts were finished, it was finished, and we were able to roll it out down to 5th Avenue, and we began the parade. 52 blocks. And must have been Columbus Circle, down to Thompson Square Park, biggest and most awe-inspiring street in the world. And it was actually a wonderful, wonderful occasion. And as I say, Lord Krishna was there glorifying Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada was there glorifying Lord Krishna. And we were all there just chanting Hare Krishna, pushing carts, pulling carts, doing what we did best, and serving and enjoying that transcendental exchange. So we got down to Thompson Square Park. No, it was Washington Square Park, not Thompson Square Park. Washington Square Park has an enormous triumphal arch. And after some difficulty getting the carts up over the curb, we were able to position them directly in front of this gigantic arched thing. It looks a bit like the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And I can see very vividly in my mind, I can still remember how beautiful those carts looked, sitting beneath this triumphal arch. Srila Prabhupada there, giving his lecture, speaking to the crowd. Prasadam was being distributed widely. There was so much prasadam being given out. There were so many people there. There were literally tens of thousands of people there. Tens and tens and tens of thousands of people attended this parade. This entire thing had been going on because Jayananda was as dedicated to Srila Prabhupada as he actually was. He had so many good qualities. All those qualities combined to create this perfection of bhakti. He didn't care about self-aggrandizement in any way, shape or form. If Jayananda was here today, as has just been said, he wouldn't have allowed this program to even exist. He wouldn't put up with it. He was not interested in glorifying himself or having himself glorified. He simply wanted to be the man that was serving. And in the background too, you know, whether it was background or foreground. Certainly in that parade he was in the foreground. He had that beautiful golden jacket on. As he steered the cart right from the front, he didn't look in the least bit ill. He looked the picture of health, and yet he was suffering from leukemia, apparently. And he was singing and dancing and chanting as he steered those carts down the 52 blocks. There were no further mishaps with the canopies. Fortunately, Krishna had allowed the thing to become broken the day before, so we didn't have to have it fall down in the middle of Fifth Avenue. We were saved once again by Lord Jagannath and his transcendental brother and sister. So the festival was a great success. Okay. That's enough. Hare Krishna. Thank you, Jayananda.
So there, I'll give you a slightly different perspective. I was completely new and just been there for a little while. And it was a huge festival, and there were lots of devotees from all over the country there. Lots of senior, Prabhupada was there, all the sannyasis, lots of sannyasis there, senior devotees from all over the country.
Reverb.
And
Reverb is on.
lots of devotees to feed. And Bali Madan he was like in charge of serving the sannyasis and senior devotees. And somehow or other, in those days I used to be a hard worker, so he took me and he had me assist him. So I was serving the senior devotees, but Jayananda wasn't in that group. He didn't join in that group. And so then, he told the other side of the story. Then the festival was over and I continued to serve in New York. And then there's this devotee, he used to come and talk to me. I think he's just one of the guys from my perspective at the time. So he used to come and talk to me, and he would, and it was interesting. He was obviously well situated, and he was very kind to me. And as I mentioned last time we spoke, in New York in those days, every Saturday night we would go, and there'd be a Harinam down to Times Square, and those were like fantastic kirtans with 60, 70 devotees. They were huge. And then on the other hand, Jayananda, he would come to me and say, "What are you doing?" "Oh yeah, I got a bit of free time." "Okay, let's go." And then he took me down. He'd take me down to what was that university downtown? Anyway, it's a university downtown, and he would take me down there, and we would chant, just the two of us. He would be chanting and I'd be responding, and it was a little strange for me. It's like, it was weird, but still he was such a nice devotee that I used to go with him, and he was just being really merciful and kind. And it was only years later that I realized who he was, because as Prabhu was saying, he was very senior person, and when he left, Prabhupada said he went back to Godhead. Prabhupada told us to put his picture on the Rath Yatra whenever there's a Rath Yatra anywhere in the world. So he was a Prabhupada man, and Prabhupada recognized his bhakti, his devotion, and so he was very, very senior person. But if you met him, I didn't know who he was. Like I said, I spent quite a bit of time with him while I was in New York. I was just a new bhakta, but he would come and give me his time and take me out chanting, as I said. And I didn't know who he was in terms of, I knew he was Jayananda obviously, but I didn't know he was such a big man. And he was a big man, but you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know it from his demeanor, from the way he behaved, from the way he operated. He was just like one of the guys, just like a simple devotee. But actually he was very advanced because of his his devotion. So we're here to honor him today, and he deserves our honor, even if he wouldn't accept it himself. But it's our duty, if you like, to honor him. He's very deserving of that, and yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
I would like to tell you some of my own experiences. When I joined the movement, I joined in the city of Berkeley. At that time, Jayananda was in San Francisco, and Berkeley is about 10 miles away. And there was a temple there because there's a big university. So sometimes we would go and meet the San Francisco devotees. So I'd have some interaction with him. I'd see him in action. And in those days, the program was, maybe by 10 or 11, we would go do Harinam Sankirtan on the street, and we would stay till 6 o'clock. And we would come home, and then we would go out again in the evening. In those days, we were staying out late. It's before Mangalartik was really instituted. We had deviated a little bit by staying out late. So anyway, the program was you would chant, and then periodically you'd be asked to distribute BTGs, which nobody wanted to do. Everybody just wanted to chant. So, after a few hours of kirtan, they'd say, okay, Prabhu, it's your turn. Because you're just sitting there with your shaved head and dhoti, and nobody wants to take a magazine. It wasn't like you wanted to do that. It's just, you have to. We didn't know how to sell them, so you just, you have to offer them to people, and, have 100 people say no before someone would take one. So, maybe in an hour you'd sell a magazine. So nobody wanted to do it. But Jayananda, that's what he did the whole time. What no one else wanted to do, he would do. So he rarely would chant with the kirtan, because he would just distribute magazines. That was, kind of like taking the burden off of us. So anyway, shortly afterwards, this was 1970, shortly afterwards, I was transferred to San Francisco. So then I got to live in the temple with him, and I got to see what he was doing. And that was also at the time when we were doing the Rath Yatra. This was 1970, San Francisco. So his schedule was quite interesting. Well, his normal schedule, the normal schedule for brahmacharis was to go to bed at 11 and get up at 4. That was everybody. His schedule was to go to bed at 11 and get up at 3. But during Rath Yatra time, his schedule was to get up, I think, about 4, and then go work on Rath Yatra. Now, you said you had 3 months. In San Francisco, they started Rath Yatra 2 weeks before. The carts weren't built. So you had 2 weeks to organize the event. And it was some kind of, how should we say, if you combine immaturity, zealousness, and enthusiasm together, then you decide to organize an event that should take 2 months in 2 weeks, because that way you can get really into it and show your devotion. That was kind of the mood. So basically, nobody slept more than 3 or 4 hours in those 2 weeks. Everybody just worked, and that's kind of the way they wanted it. And the temple president made a vow. He doesn't remember. I asked him, Madhavisi, he doesn't remember. But he made a vow not to sleep for those 2 weeks. So that was kind of the mood. These 2 weeks we just get into it. So Jayananda's schedule was he'd get up at 4, and then he'd go out with his crew and work on the carts, and he'd come back at 10 o'clock at night and chant his rounds till midnight. That was that's the schedule I saw. And so Jayananda, for us, Jayananda was his own tattva. It's like he didn't fit in any category of any other devotee. It was just, it wasn't like anyone was envious of him or anyone ever thought they could be like him. It was just, he was Jayananda, and that's what he was and who he was. And you wouldn't even, although you'd be inspired by him, you wouldn't even think you could in any way be like him. Now I wanted to tell you a little bit what he's like. I want to tell you a story first to give you an idea. There was a devotee in Dallas, Texas, named Kirtida. And Kirtida had left her body in Dallas, and she was a disciple to Mount Krishna Maharaj. And he wanted her to leave in Dallas rather than in Vrindavan because she had many friends there. And he also thought it would be a good lesson because she was so Krishna conscious. So she was so dear to the devotees that she was constantly surrounded by devotees who were serving her, including Tamal Krishna Maharaj, who spent many hours with her. But her last few weeks, or maybe a few months, was surrounded with devotees in kirtan. And then when she died, Tamal Krishna Maharaj said, don't think that you're going to be surrounded by so many people serving you the way she was served. And he said she was served this way because her entire life she served people. And what we came to learn is that before she was a devotee, she was a nurse. And she served in the hospital to the point that she herself was losing her health. She hardly would eat. She was taking care of the patients. So she'd go on these shifts, 15 hours, 20 hours, 24 hours, and she would forget to eat. So that was her nature. And so then Tamal Krishna Maharaj said, she was born that way. She had that nature. He said, I can't even hope in my life, I cannot hope to even get close to that service nature that she had. It was just special. So I would say the same thing about Jayananda. His nature was such that I had never met, before I was a devotee, anybody like that, and I never met a devotee like that. And his nature was just, it was like, he just had this intense eagerness to be the last in line and do the most menial service. I was just reading today that in San Francisco temple, not the one I was in, but later temple, I had left to go to another temple before that, but the shower was in the garage. So Jayananda would come in and everyone was lined up, and the first thing he would do is pay obeisances to everybody, and then he would stand in the back of the line, and he's the senior-most person. And you think, senior-most person, what do? Do they stand in the back or do they go to the front? He would go to the back and everyone would say, Jayananda, go to the front. He'd say, no, I'll stand in the back. That was just his nature. He came to Mayapur for the first time with Bhaktidas. So they welcomed him. They had prasadam for him and Bhaktidas and other senior devotees. And they sat him down to take prasadam, and he said, I can't do this. He got up to serve. And he said, no, Jayananda, you have to sit down. You have to sit down. We're going to serve you. He said, I can't do this. I can't allow you to serve him. And they tried to force him. And they couldn't force him. He just got up and served. That was his nature. That's who he was. That was just Jayananda. Take out the trash. Go buy the boga. He was the driver on the Sankirtan party. He was the one who... It was kind of like if you had a Jayananda in your temple, you didn't have to worry about anything because everything would get done. So you hear stories of Jayananda going to bed at midnight. Why? Because he's up in the kitchen till midnight cleaning. Not asking anybody to clean. Always asking people to clean to help him. He would always do it. He would never, you clean and then go in the office. It was always, let's do this together, like that. So, my association with him was in that period, and in that period, we worked together a little bit, thank you. And basically it was like, how do you say it? He was like the father. You know, the father just kind of does everything. Just takes care. Anything goes wrong, the father takes care. That's what he was like. He was like the father. If he was there, you wouldn't have to worry. And then my next association with him was years later. He liked to do festivals, so we had a Govardhan Puja festival in San Diego because the temple was called New Govardhan. So he came, and because he was like festival personified, he was brought down to organize the festivals. This is what he loved to do. and they make huge buckets, trash cans full of gulab jamuns, and go around and all the guests and put them in their mouths. Open your mouth. And so he was festival man personified. But the most amazing personal experience I had of him was in his last years, because I lived in the San Diego Temple. The San Diego Temple is on the border of Mexico, and for the treatment of his leukemia, there was an alternative treatment, and it was illegal in America, but there was a clinic in Tijuana. So he went to Tijuana, and then the devotees would go see him, and then we would get the news of what was going on. So it was quite amazing. I don't know if anybody knows this. I haven't read this in any books about him. But it's quite amazing what was going on there. I think this might have been maybe 6 months before he left his body. He was doing this cure, and it was kind of getting better, but not really, and it was going slow, and so he was not in good health by any means. He would get up every morning at 3 o'clock. This was like the last months of his life. He'd get up every morning at 3 o'clock and have a morning program. What do you do when you get sick? You just stay in bed. Here in his last days, he had this very strict morning program. And then he was holding Bhagavad Gita class in the hospital. And he was going around the hospital preaching and then getting people to come to his Bhagavad Gita class. Did you know that? Yeah. So this was going on for a while, but this is the amazing thing that happened. After a while, the hospital stopped him. And then he said, if I can't preach here, what's the use of staying here? And he left. He wasn't going to stay in the hospital if he couldn't preach. Of course, at that time, it looked like he could get better, but it was a slow and expensive process, and it wasn't for sure. So he wrote Prabhupada and said, I don't really want to maintain my body. It's expensive. And anyway, that was his mood. And Prabhupada agreed. But anyway, I don't know the details, but he came to San Diego Temple. And he stayed with us for a while before he went to Los Angeles. I think he was still going back. He must have been going back to Tijuana. He didn't want to stay there anymore. He couldn't preach there. So he was staying upstairs. And he shouldn't have stayed upstairs because he couldn't really walk. They didn't want him to walk up, but it was the only place we had. And of course, he wouldn't complain. But one of the things I remember specifically, now, this is what year did he die? 76? 77. So this is, so this is now 77. And so, a lot of devotees joining in this temple. A lot of people in this temple had only joined a few years ago. So they're, let's say, joining in 74, 75, 76. And Jayananda's from 1968. So he's like senior most devotee. As far as the West Coast is concerned, he's like the oldest devotee on the West Coast. The only other devotees came from New York. So here, he comes to class, and he sits in the class, and he listens, and he takes notes. Doesn't want to give the class. And he asks questions, very humbly asking questions, like he doesn't know anything. Now, if you were a new devotee and you didn't know who he was, you would definitely think he's a new bhakta, because that's how he asks questions, like a new bhakta. You know how new bhaktas ask questions? Kind of innocent, I don't really understand this, could you explain this, what does this mean? Like that. It was amazing to see that. It was so genuine, so real. And it was like his level of realness, his level of humility, it was so off the charts, as we say in America. It was so beyond what is normal that so many devotees will tell you that the reason they became devotees and the reason they stayed in Krishna consciousness was because of Jayananda. And the interesting thing about some of these devotees who tell you this, some of these devotees are like very heavy characters. San Francisco Temple had some very heavy characters, like a la Hell's Angels type, those kinds of people. And Jayananda's association, it just melted them. So I became a devotee because of Jayananda, because he was so, it's so hard to describe what he's like because there's nobody like this. But he was so real from the heart. He never criticized anyone. He always appreciated everyone. He was always positive. He was always ready to do anything. He was always encouraging. And somehow or other, everybody fell in love with him, devotees, non-devotees. And he was like the Goswamis, Dhira Janapriya. There wasn't anybody that didn't love him. That was just, it was like, it was impossible not to love him. There was nothing about him you couldn't love. It wasn't like, 20, 80, 90% of the movement liked him, but 10% had issues. Which is kind of normal, right? Everybody's got an issue with somebody. Everybody loved Jayananda because there was nothing about him not to love. So he had, like Bhaskar was saying, he had this like Shakti, and he could meet somebody and get them to engage in service, like in 5 minutes. Somehow or other. I don't know if you know. You probably know this story, but I think this personifies Jayananda more than anything about this. That, well, there's two stories. You know the story about him stealing clothes? Oh, this is such a good story. Personifies Jayananda. Well, first I'll tell another story. He didn't like to spend money. So, in San Francisco, where they're building the carts, there was a bar across the street, and he used to go and give them prasadam. Because that was his nature. He would just go and give prasadam. And he didn't, if I said, hey, Bhaskar, let's go in the bar and give prasadam, you might go, I don't think we should go in there. It's too scummy in there. It's too mode of ignorance. The people, I don't want to hang out with them. Jayananda would just, no, he didn't discriminate. It was like bums on the street, anybody. He just was their friend. He'd give them prasadam. So he went in, used to give them prasadam, and then one day the devotees were working on the cart, and it was time for prasadam. There wasn't any prasadam, so they had to go grocery shopping and they didn't have any money. So he went into the bar and he told everybody. He said, we're all working over here, we're hungry, we don't have anything, can you give us some money? And he came out with $126, which in 1976 was probably like $300, something like that. Kind of interesting. So, he probably could have got the money, but anyway, he didn't like to spend money. So, one time they needed some clothes, so he went shopping. But he didn't have the heart to pay for it, because it was Prabhupada's money. So he just stole the clothes. And guess what happened? He got caught. And he had to go to court. And he was honest with the judge. And he just said, I'm a monk, I have this mission, and this mission is so important, it's saving the world, and I just couldn't bear to spend the money. And the judge was so overtaken. I mean, in the history of his judicial service, maybe in the history of the judicial system of the universe, that probably never happened and probably never will happen. And just to show you the nature of Jayananda, how he turned people's hearts, the judge said, okay, just go, just let him go. You can see here, this person is a saint. So then there's this other story that exemplifies his influence on people where, I believe it was in New York, they had to get a permit for Rath Yatra, and the one lady there she was tough, very hard-hearted, very tough. And Jayananda would get the permits from her. Perhaps he was the only one who could give the permits. But she was kind of what we call in America poker face. You know what poker face is? If you're playing cards, if you're playing poker, you can't make a face because the other person will know, oh, you have a good hand, they could see it in your face. So poker face is you don't make any face. You're always like this. Russians are like that, right? No, so we can say Russian face, not poker face. So she was a Russian face. Like this, very, very stern. So, you know the story? Who knows the story? One year, they came in to get the permits, and she asked, so where's Johnny Ananda? As he was known, Jim or Johnny Ananda. She said, where's Johnny Ananda? And then they informed her that Johnny Ananda had left his body. She broke down. She got up and she couldn't deal with it. She just broke down. She went, I think, in another office. Then she grabbed her composure and she came back. This hard-hearted lady. So that shows you the nature of Jayananda, just the way who he was and how he interacted with people. It made this indelible impression. You couldn't forget him. It was impossible. It was impossible to forget him. So he was this combination of an exalted, very exalted devotee, and simultaneously completely unassuming and totally, he always wanted to be in the back. He always wanted to be the assistant. And I think it's a very good example, because what happens in our movement, as you remain, if you stay long enough, you get pushed up to a position. And the more you get pushed up, the less menial service you have to do, and the more other people do it. And in fact, people won't even let you do it. And Jayananda was pretty much the opposite. He wouldn't let anybody serve him. And he wouldn't let anybody prevent him from doing menial service. And menial service was his life and soul. So, how can we benefit from hearing about him? It seems to me he had no false ego. Like Bhaskar was saying, he told him something was wrong with the cart, so immediately he listened. I think we can take inspiration. Just thinking about him, becoming inspired to be a little more, how should we say, willing to do the menial, willing to be corrected, willing to serve, willing to go a little bit out of our way, willing to do, he didn't, it's like he never would complain. He just, right? He liked, they used to go, this is another Jayananda classic, they used to go to the Boga market, right? So before they go on the Boga market, they had this huge dustbin. You know what the dustbin is? It's like a big metal trash can. They're maybe 3 meters, 2 meters by 3 or 4 meters. And that's where they throw all the old produce they can't sell. So that's the first place he would go, and he would dive in, we call dumpster diving. That's what the, street people do, dumpster diving. He would dive into the dumpster, and he would get everything out of the dumpster, and then load the van. But 80% of what they got was from the dumpster. So it wasn't like, he wasn't like, hey, I'm Jayananda, I don't dive in dumpsters. Bhakta Paul, you go in. No, it wasn't like that. I'm Jayananda, I am the oldest devotee, both in years and age, in this temple. I am basically the first devotee. Prabhupada likes me. I don't do dumpster diving. It wasn't like that. It was like, this is service, this is seva for Prabhupada, I want to do it. That's who he was. So I think we can take inspiration like that in our own service, that he saw every service is valuable, and it wasn't like this service is better than that. And he was, the devotees tell these stories. Jayananda used to glorify the Sankirtan devotees. He would make their lunch, he would drive them out on Sankirtan, and he would say, you're all glorious, you're doing this wonderful service, and I'm just fixing the cars. He was a mechanic. He would take out the trash, and he would clean the temple, and he would fix the cars. And he said, you're glorious, I'm just a mechanic. That's how he would think. Honestly think like that. And then he got into this mood. He was a temple president, and he got into this mood that Sankirtan is the highest, and he used to be a taxi cab driver, so he was a good driver. And he said, I just want to drive the Sankirtan devotees. I want to be their driver. And he wrote Prabhupada a letter and said, can I resign from temple president and be the driver of the Sankirtan devotees? Now, you might not think that's a big thing, but in those days of ISKCON, temple president was a big thing. The devotees actually served the temple president. They actually followed him, they honored him, they were cooperative. In later years in ISKCON, becoming temple president was difficult, much more difficult. But in those days, devotees were very, very submissive to the temple president. Temple president was like Guru. And he renounced that and said, I just want to drive the Sankirtan van. He wrote Prabhupada a letter. And Prabhupada said, yes, serving the Sankirtan is higher than being temple president. And he let him resign. And he became the driver of the Sankirtan devotees. So that's his mood. It's just if I can assist you, you know. It's not like, hey, you know, let me outdo them. That wasn't his mood. You know, why can't I be a Sankirtan devotee? They're Sankirtan devotees. I shouldn't drive them. So that was his mood. So I think so much we can learn from that mood. Do menial service, take it all as valuable, serve. And even though you're this exalted, advanced devotee, you don't think you're special at all. You don't ask anything special for yourself. But instead, what do? You serve the devotees prasadam. He always served, right? He always served prasadam. And everyone was satisfied, then he eats. That's Jayananda. I don't know if you can imitate it, but that's who he was. Jayananda Thakur ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Go Premanand. In the early days of the movement, at least in California, this is how you kept devotees awake in class. As I said, we would go to bed at 11, wake up at 4. Some devotees would join Jayananda 11 to 3. So you needed something to wake you up. And this is how you get woken up. But Jayananda would always fall asleep because he worked the hardest and slept the least, but nobody would dare shoot Jayananda. Krishna Para Sahagana Lalita Shivishaka Nihamcha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Namaniti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Samyavari Chacha Vishakarine Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Punamane Srivashavanavi Devi Vaikaya Kripataye Krishna Sambandha Vijnana Daine Prabhave Namaha Madhujjvala Namo Mahavandhaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Jayananda Prabhu Niti Namane Isha Puspanjali Jayananda Thakur ki jai. Namo Vishnu Padaya, Vishnu Prishtaya Bhutale, Srimate Jayananda Prabhu, Iti Namane, Esha Pushpanjali, Jayananda Thakur ki jai. Namo Vishnu Padaya, Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale, Srimate Jayananda Prabhu, Iti Namane, Esha Pushpanjali, Sriman Jayananda Thakur ki jai.
Krishna Krishna Hare Hare
Jayananda Thakur, 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 and then he would add lines to it. Hari Hari Bo, taking prasadam, Hari Hari Bo. And then one Rati Acho, and they were lifting a rail to put on the cart. Hari Hari Bo, lift up the rail, Hari Hari Bo. Jayananda Thakur ki jai. Jai Om Vishnupada Paramahamsa Parivraja Charya Sthatara Sishisaran Isavayande Isavoy Charanaravinda Bhakti Vedanta Swami